On Voyage back, page 326. Escaping from the estate had been a nightmare. Philip had been shot twice. One bullet had passed relatively harmlessly through the fleshy part of his side, but the second had buried itself in his back, just to the right of the fifth vertebra. Jean had taken a bullet through her shoulder, but amazingly, after they had staunched the flow of blood, she could still use her other arm to help Katia, now fully dressed in shorts and t-shirt, transport food. When the car wouldn't start, Neil found in the garage a wheelbarrow and a large garden cart. He carried Philip outside and placed him in the two-wheeled cart. Jean and Katia brought out the boxes, cartons and plastic bags of food and packed them gently around the wounded Philip. They put the heavier foodstuffs into the wheelbarrow, with Neil towing the garden cart like a dray horse and Katia pushing the wheelbarrow. Jean, insisting that she was still strong enough, bicycled one-handed on ahead of them. On the deserted road into town, an old black couple they passed looked enviously at the food and seemed to conclude that Philip was a rich man being pulled by a servant. As they entered the outskirts of the city, they began to hear gunfire, but the streets were still mostly empty. They saw only an occasional bicycle or motorcycle racing away from the violence. When they came to within 100 yards of the docks, the smoke from the explosions both masked and impeded their progress. Jean's wound finally had brought her near to collapse, and Neil carried her on his back the last 100 feet. When he arrived coughing, sweat-soaked, exhausted, but unhurt by shell or shrapnel, he was disorientated, unaware of the conflict aboard the mollycoddle. Frank and Jim took Jean as she slid semi-conscious from Neil's back, assuring her that Lisa had been found safe on Scorpio. Sheila and Tony carried Philip aboard. The others brought the food. 5 minutes later, they motored Mollycoddle away from the docks with Scorpio rafted to her side, and then took her in tow with Ollie, Jim, and Lisa aboard her to help Oscar. Events were now out of control. Mollycoddle plunged and ploughed against the wind and waves, which careered towards them as if pushed by white demons. Spray exploded aft against the windows, cutting off visibility. Philip and Jean were placed on the long settee in the back of the Mollycoddle's lower steering controls, and Macklin was trying to examine their wounds. 50 yards away, water burst high in the air, making Neil fear the waves were smashing against some wreck or uncharted rock, until he realised it was an explosion. A quarter of a mile off to port, the gigantic white Norway lay placidly at anchor, surrounded by a dozen small boats, all scrambling to come alongside and unload passengers. The Norway's wide boarding ladder was packed with people shoving their way upward. Waterspouts burst in the sea around her. When Neil looked back across 100 yards of water to the dock, he saw an explosion rock the boat that had been moored behind them, sending its mast toppling over into the sea. They motored out against the swells to the mouth of the harbour and then cut Scorpio loose to sail off to Antigua, where they hoped to rendezvous the next day. Tony warned Neil that Mollycoddle's fuel gauge registered empty, but this seemed trivial. As they continued on back to pick up Vagabond, the Norway gave 4 blasts of its horn and began hauling anchor. A fire was burning on the afterdeck, smoke streaming out horizontally shoreward of the fierce wind. Vagabond, lying to 2 anchors, veered out at about 60 degrees from a bow and tore and plunged like a maddened horse at a tether. When Mollycoddle came alongside, Katia and Tony put fenders in place and got the mooring lines tight. Everyone began unloading the new food and transferring the wounded to Vagabond, and Neil had to force himself to consider the next steps. He felt weary, worried about Jean's wound, and burdened with some nagging sense of foreboding that had been with him since the capture of Mollycoddle. The seas were building too high. The Civil War was too unpredictable. The sun would be gone in half an hour. 4 more blasts from Norway's horn sent a chill through him. "We can't get either of the anchors up," Frank reported to Neil between gasps. "Cut one," said Neil. "Cut it now, and let's not waste time. If Tony can't pull the other out, cut it too if you have to." 10 minutes later, Mollycoddle, with Vagabond in tow, plunged towards the mouth of the harbour. Macklin had finished cleaning Jean and Philip's bullet wounds. He couldn't tell how seriously Philip had been torn up inside, but with Vagabond bucking and rolling as she was, they agreed it was useless to poke around to see. Neil realised for the first time that leaving land might mean sentencing Philip to death. Yet neither Philip nor Sheila had suggested they stay to look for a doctor. And now they were committed to the sea. Ashore, Michael and his men would be waiting for them. When he stood up and peered into the wind and spray, Neil felt frightened again. At any moment a tow line might snap, an anchor drag, an engine fail. Someone might fall overboard. As Mollycoddle crashed forward, he watched the Norway moving seaward off their port beam. She was still hauling anchor, and smoke was still billowing out astern. Her decks were packed. When Macklin finished checking Jean, Neil carried her down to her cabin and lifted her up onto her berth. As he was tying Jean and Skip into the berth so they wouldn't roll out, he felt a strange new motion and a new sound that at first he couldn't place. As he hurried back up on deck, he suddenly knew. The engine had stopped. Mollycoddle had run out of fuel. "Get aboard!" Neil shouted to Tony as Mollycoddle drifted rapidly back towards Vagabond. "Frank! Ready to cut the tow line!" He himself ran towards the mainmast, stumbling when Mollycoddle crashed into them, then getting up again to loosen the halyard and began hauling up the already triple-reefed mainsail. He was dimly concerned that no one had been assigned to Vagabond's helm, but someone. The triple-reefed main, flogging loudly, went up, and he winched it up tight, tied it down, and began raising the storm jib. With a loud twang, the tow line flew past his leg, and Vagabond lurched away from Mollycoddle, which was drifting more slowly now. Neil quickly tied down the jib halyard and raced aft. Sheila was at the helm, but as he approached she let go of the wheel to help catch his sheet in the storm jib, which was loose and flogging. They were drifting off onto a starboard tack, and it seemed they were being pushed almost sideways downwind. The daggerboard was up. "Daggerboard!" he shouted forward to Frank, pointing. Frank nodded and staggered to the place just after the mast to begin forcing down the 12-foot-long central daggerboard, 5 feet of which should have been under the boat cutting down leeway. In the 2 minutes it took to get it down, Macklin had gone forward to lend his strength. Vagabond had ploughed and plunged forward, sliding sideways too, towards Smith Point on the left side of the harbour. Land was less than a quarter of a mile away. The docks behind them were about 3/4 of a mile off. With the daggerboard finally down, the ship gained speed and began to point better up towards the wind. "Will she come about in this?" Sheila asked him. "She'd better," Neil said, knowing their lives depended on it. Frank was already at the port jib sheet, Katia and Tony ready to release the jib in the opposite cockpit. "Don't release the jib until I yell!" Neil shouted. "You backwinding the jib?" Sheila asked. "Coming about!" he shouted and swung the wheel full to starboard. Vagabond laboured slowly up into the wind, the 5-foot seas smashing into her 3 hulls with loud cracks, spray flying aft. Squinting forward through the hulled and steaming plexiglass windows of the wheelhouse, Neil could barely see the jib in the gathering dust. Vagabond plunged, rocked and shuddered dead into the wind, both sails snapping as they luffed. The jib, still held close-hauled for the starboard tack, was now beginning to be backwinded, pushing the bow further around onto the desired new tack. Vagabond swung around to starboard with increased momentum. Katia released the jib the instant Neil gave the command, and Frank winched it in on the other side. With 2 more tacks, they were out of the harbour and heading east at half a mile from the south coast of St. Thomas. The waves outside the harbour were immense, huge, grey, ugly, spoon-covered swells barrelling in at their starboard side, sending them sliding through down into the trough, only to be hit broadside by the next crest with a sickening crash. Philip lay moaning now on the deck of the wheelhouse, where he had lolled off from the first angry swell had smacked into them at a 45-degree tilt. Frank had vomited onto the control panel shelf. Macklin had staggered below, useless with nausea. With Sheila tending to her husband, only Neil, Frank and Tony and Katia remained in the central cockpit. It was dark. During their last tack night had fallen with the swiftness of the tropics, and Neil had only his compass to steer by. The sky was totally overcast. There were no navigational aids along the south coast, only rocks. A breaking wave rolled into Vagabond with a shattering crash, which sounded as if a hand grenade had exploded against her right side. "She can't take this," Frank said to Neil from beside her. Neil stared back at him, uncomprehendingly. "Vagabond can't take this beating!" Frank shouted. Maybe she couldn't. But what the hell choice did they have? Neil thought. To run before the seas meant running onto the rocks of St. Thomas. Then he thought of the daggerboard. "Bring the daggerboard halfway up!" Neil shouted to Tony. "We'll let her slide some," he explained to Frank, who nodded. Tony snapped on a safety harness and crawled forward. Even in the darkness Neil could get some sense of each wave as it approached, and as he watched carefully as Tony snapped his safety line to a shroud and began crawling on his hands and knees across the main cabin roof to get the daggerboard up. Once there he began trying to winch the board up, but he needed someone to tail the line. "Give him a hand!" Neil shouted instinctively, and Katia left to crawl across the foredeck towards Tony. Even as she did, Neil caught sight of an unusually large wave bearing down on them, breaking on top. "Hold on!" he yelled and tried to turn Vagabond away to take the shock further aft, but it was too late. The waves struck Vagabond broadside with an explosive crack. A river of water 2 feet deep swirled across the main cabin top, burying Tony and Katya. Water crashed into the starboard cockpit and someone screamed. Vagabond was jolted to port by the blow, left wallowing, and then sailed on. Neil could feel water swirling around his feet, felt Frank's arms around him, saw Tony, saved by his safety line, clutching a shroud on the port side, then beginning to crawl back towards the daggerboard, like some persistent insect momentarily pushed away by an intruding finger. Sheila came up beside him, and she too clutching at him for balance. "Where's Katya?" she shouted. Neil searched the port side, hoping to see her clinging to a shroud, but she was gone. The next wave was big, but Vagabond appeared to slide away, letting it roll under her, and the wave only gave her a playful slap. As the trimaran surged forward, Neil thought Vagabond into the wind to stop her, but she turned sluggishly, unresponsively to the helm. "No, Neil!" Frank shouted. "It's no use!" Even as Neil had swung the wheel around, his mind told him there was nothing he could do. It was dark. Katya did not have light, nor was Vagabond equipped with a marker board with a light or a transmitter. There was no point trying to find her. Even if she could keep swimming until daylight, there was still no chance they could beat their way back and locate her with the wind and seas still running like this. He mechanically turned Vagabond back on course. Tony had staggered back to him at the helm. "Katya went over," he shouted. "She's back there," he added, pointing. Shaken, Neil looked at him, nodded, and kept the helm steady. "We can't help her," Frank said hoarsely from beside him. "Aren't you coming about?" Tony asked them, still grasping for breath. "She's a good swimmer. We've got a searchlight." "We can't do it, Tony," Neil said, staring ahead, aware now of the ache in his throat. "We'd probably kill everyone if we stopped now," Frank added. "We've got to get past the point." "But we've got to try," Tony said fiercely. "She's lost," Frank said, putting one of his huge bony hands on Tony's shoulder. "Katya's gone, and there isn't a chance in a trillion we could find her. We've got to sail on." Tony had finally realised how close he himself had come to being lost as well. He looked briefly at the huge seas rolling at them, and then back astern towards where Katya had disappeared, and emitted a low, harsh groan. He turned back and lowered his head. "It was my fault," Neil said, shaking his head. "I should have gone forward myself. I should never have sent anyone without a safety harness." "A stanchion broke off," Frank said, as if in defence of Neil. "The sea will always break a stanchion if you give it a chance," Neil replied. "Never, never, never let her go," he muttered. For another minute they all stood in darkness, staring forward. "She's gone," Tony said softly, flatly. "I'm sorry, Tony," Neil said, tears finally appearing on his cheeks, and then his grief was checked by sudden fear. Vagabond's easier motion meant that cracking noise when the wave hit. "The daggerboard's gone," Neil said harshly. Tony then informed them they hadn't made any progress when the wave hit. The 12-foot daggerboard must have broken off flush with the 5 bottom of the boat. "The ocean's way of correcting a captain's error," Neil added bitterly. "Will we still clear the tip of the island?" Sheila asked. A minor, casual, life-or-death question. And if we cleared St. Thomas, there was still St. John and Flanagan Island to clear. "I doubt it," said Neil. "Which anchor did you save?" Neil asked Frank. "It would never hold. It didn't matter. 3 anchors wouldn't hold in this. He couldn't even see the coast of the islands he was trying to avoid. It would never hold. It didn't matter. 3 anchors wouldn't hold in this. He couldn't even see the coast of the islands he was trying to avoid. Wouldn't see even at the moment Vagabond first began smashing herself to pieces. "We may not clear the tip of the island," he said, talking as much to himself as to the others, trying to clear his own mind. It was a no-win situation. You sailed closer to the wind, you'd lose speed and make 3 times as much leeway. If you continued on this reach, your course was so close to the tip of the islands that the waves would still put you up on the rocks. And though they might clear the rest of St. Thomas, Dog Rocks stuck out even further south. Dog Rocks, what a place to die. "I'll shift the battery over so we can use the depth meter," Frank said gently to Neil, and went below. "Can you reef the mizzen?" Sheila asked. "Yes, why?" asked Neil. "If we have to try to tack offshore, the mizzen could help us come about." "Come about? In this? With no daggerboard?" Neil felt like crying. "I don't think I could even get Vagabond in irons, much less bring her about," he said quietly. "Then it is in the hands of the gods," Sheila said softly. "One of them sure as hell got to be a better sailor than I am," Neil commented bitterly, thinking again of Katya. And so they sailed on, using the depth meter and a local chart that Sheila brought over to Vagabond from the gear from Doubloon. Neil guessed what the time was when they cleared the tip of St. Thomas and what their course would be to clear Dog Rocks. He sent Tony forward to listen to the surf breaking ahead. Frank brought up the boat's 12-volt spotlight to search ahead constantly as well. Neil turned the helm over to Sheila so that he could concentrate all his meagre resources on determining Vagabond's probable speed, leeway and direction, plotting a course on Sheila's chart, and ordering the minor course changes that might let them get a little bit further over to the windward. And in the blackness of that night, the sounds of waves crashing against rocks or reef, less than 100 yards away, no less than 3 times, terrified them into preparing for disaster, yet somehow sailed through. At one point when Sheila was wielding the spotlight, they saw surf shattering itself against a reef less than 40 feet off to port. At another point, Vagabond struck something, probably since her depth meter was registering 8 feet of water, a little shaft of coral, but she sailed on. By midnight, the storm winds, as Philip and Neil had expected so long ago in their initial planning session, moved around to the southwest, and the seas and wind began to fall. Free now of the last of the cays and the reefs, they were able to sail easily due east. It was just possible, thought Neil as he came back upon deck after checking on Philip and Jean, that they might survive this night after all.